Hello, and welcome to Sleepy Histories. When we imagine the Great Maya collapse, we often see a haunting, romanticized mystery, a sudden disappearance where millions of people seemingly evaporated into the emerald shadows of the jungle, leaving their magnificent stone pyramids to be swallowed by vines in a silent, ghostly instant. But the real life of the Maya during this transition was far more complex, a grueling and calculated struggle against a changing planet. It wasn't a supernatural vanishing act, but a slow-motion collision between high-tech engineering and a brutal, century-long environmental crisis. So tonight, we will leave the legends behind and see what it was really like. We will explore the porous limestone geology of the seasonal desert, the sophisticated hydraulic reservoirs designed to trap the sky, and the microscopic chemical signatures of drought hidden in ancient lake mud. If you find peace in these journeys through time, please like and subscribe, and share your location and local time in the comments below. The year is 250 AD. You are standing within the central corridor of the Yucatan Peninsula. At first glance, the environment presents as a monolithic expanse of green, an overgrowth of mahogany, cedar, and ceiba trees that suggests an inexhaustible abundance. However, this is a deceptive ecological facade. You observe a landscape defined by a paradoxical geological identity. The Yucatan is a seasonal desert. Unlike the perennial river valleys of the Nile or the Indus, this territory lacks a consistent surface-level water supply despite its tropical classification. The humidity of the air, currently registered at near saturation levels, clings to your skin with a heavy, oppressive weight. Yet the soil beneath your feet remains a precarious stage for any civilization. The foundational geology is composed of porous limestone bedrock, a karst landscape that acts as a massive mineral sponge. Every step you take feels heavy, the air thick enough to swallow, mask-like and damp, while the ground beneath remains deceptively hollow and hungry for the very moisture that chokes the air. You watch as a weather system moves in from the Caribbean. The rhythm of the environment is dictated entirely by the summer rains that fall between June and September. In these months, the sky transitions to a bruised purple, and the initial impact of the deluge is a sensory assault. You hear the deafening, percussive sound of heavy rain hitting broad, waxy leaves, a roar that drowns out the calls of the howler monkeys. For a few moments, the forest floor is awash with rushing plumes of water. But as quickly as the downpour ceases, a mechanical process of infiltration begins. Listen to the sudden, eerie silence as the water does not pool or form streams, but instead vanishes. It is being pulled downward, dissolving into the limestone, disappearing into a labyrinthine network of cracks, caves, and subterranean rivers. One moment, a flood; the next, nothing but the sound of your own breath and the damp, thirsty stone. This hydrological reality creates a stratification of survival. In the northern reaches of the peninsula, the limestone shelf sits near sea level, allowing for the collapse of cave ceilings to form cenotes, natural sinkholes that provide access to the water table. But as you move into the southern Maya areas, the elevation rises, and the water table drops significantly. Here, the life-sustaining groundwater is trapped hundreds of feet below the surface, rendering manual extraction through primitive well digging entirely unfeasible for an ancient population. You observe the local flora. The lushness of the ferns and the density of the canopy are not signs of a permanent water source, but rather a frantic 4-month binge on the seasonal rains. This is a region where the margin for error is non-existent. Without the ability to harness the fleeting moisture of the summer months, the landscape during the long dry season becomes a monochromatic graveyard of parched brush and calcified stone. Every plant, every creature is living on borrowed time. Beneath the canopy, you can touch the jagged white edges of the limestone outcroppings. The texture is sharp and abrasive, the result of millennia of carbonic acid in the rainwater slowly eating away at the rock. The Maya who inhabit this space between 250 and 750 AD are not simply living in a jungle. They are surviving on the surface of a biological sieve. Every gallon of water required for agriculture, for the slaking of lime in construction and for human consumption must be strategically managed before it escapes into the dark, inaccessible depths. The scarcity of surface water dictates the entire layout of their society. You see the stress of this environment in the way the soil dries and cracks, turning the vibrant green world into a brittle, flammable hazard. As you traverse the southern lowlands, the technical reality becomes clear. The success of the Maya civilization was not an accident of nature, but a triumph of calculated intervention. They had to find a way to trap the sky. They had to transform this seasonal desert into a permanent reservoir. By the year 750 AD, the survival of Tikal is no longer a matter of chance, but a triumph of hydraulic engineering. You observe the city's topographic layout, where the natural limestone ridges have been radically modified into a vast artificial drainage basin because the southern lowlands lack permanent rivers or accessible groundwater. The Maya have transitioned from mere inhabitants of the land to its primary architects. The logic is strictly vertical. In a landscape where the water table remains hundreds of feet below the surface, the only viable source of hydration falls from the sky. To capture this ephemeral resource, the Maya have reshaped their urban center into a concave collector. You walk upon the paved plazas and causeways, noticing they are not perfectly level. They are tilted at precise gradients to funnel every liter of seasonal rainfall toward massive excavated depressions. These depressions are the city's reservoirs, many of which originated as quarries. Once the limestone blocks were extracted to build the towering pyramids of the Great Plaza, the resulting voids were repurposed. Engineering teams lined these basins with several layers of plaster and clay, creating an impermeable seal to prevent the porous bedrock from absorbing the stored volume. The scale of this infrastructure is immense. Calculations of the central reservoirs, such as the Temple Reservoir, the Palace Reservoir, and the Hidden Reservoir, reveal a combined capacity to sustain 10,000 people for up to 18 months without a single drop of new rain. This is a technical buffer against the volatility of the tropical climate, a safeguard against the specter of the seasonal desert. You descend into one of the smaller feeder canals, where the air is noticeably cooler and more humid than on the sun-scorched plazas above. Here you feel the cool, damp touch of hewn stone, smoothed by centuries of flowing water. The silence of the canal is interrupted by the rhythmic scraping of flint and wooden tools as laborers clear the accumulated silt from the channel bed. This maintenance is critical. Even a minor obstruction of sediment can disrupt the hydraulic pressure necessary to move water across the city. The labor is grueling and constant, a thermodynamic cost paid in human sweat to ensure the circulatory system of the city remains functional. The strategic placement of these reservoirs on the hilltops is the defining feature of the Maya hydraulic system. By positioning the water reserves at the highest points of the urban core, the engineers harness the fundamental force of gravity. You can trace the primary arteries of this system as they exit the central reservoirs, branching into a network of stone-lined canals and sluice gates. By manipulating these gates, the city's administrators can direct water down the slopes to the residential zones and, crucially, to the agricultural terraces below. This is gravity-fed irrigation in its most disciplined form. The water does not merely sit in state, it is put to work, cascading through the social strata of Tikal, beginning with the elite and ending in the fields of the commoners. This engineering feat serves a dual purpose. It is both a life support system and a mechanism of political control. In the Maya world of 750 AD, the control of water is synonymous with the right to rule. The Holy Lord resides at the apex of this vertical system. By overseeing the construction and maintenance of the hilltop reservoirs, the ruling class asserts a monopoly over the most vital resource in the Yucatan. During the height of the dry season, when the surrounding jungle turns brittle and brown, the reservoirs of Tikal remain deep and dark. The sight of these full basins is a psychological tool, a visible manifestation of the ruler's ability to intercede with the rain deities and manage the physics of the earth. To live in Tikal is to be tethered to this centralized authority. To be denied access to the reservoir's bounty is a death sentence. The technical precision of the masonry reflects this gravity of power. The joints between the stone blocks are tight, sealed with a mortar of burnt lime and sand that has cured into a rock-hard consistency. You observe the spillways, designed to prevent the reservoirs from overflowing and undermining their own embankments during the torrential downpours. The engineering is not merely about storage, it is about the management of velocity. Every angle of every canal is a calculated decision. As you move through the lower residential sectors, the canals become narrower. The stone is less finely dressed, but the physics remain the same. The city is a machine for the capture and distribution of energy in the form of liquid. This efficiency has allowed Tikal to reach a population density that should be impossible in a tropical forest. This engineering marvel supported a population explosion that would soon test the limits of the land. By the mid-8th century, the mechanical and agricultural investments of the previous generations have culminated in a demographic explosion. You are observing the lowland Maya territory at its absolute zenith, roughly 750 AD, a period historians classify as the height of the Classic period. The logistical coordination required to sustain this civilization is staggering. Across the Yucatan Peninsula and the Peta Nation, the total Maya population has scaled to an estimated 13 million inhabitants. This density is comparable to the most industrialized regions of the pre-modern world, turning the jungle into a contiguous landscape of managed resources, stone causeways, and urban sprawl. From the summit of a limestone temple, you observe the curvature of the earth, meeting a horizon defined not by wilderness, but by the jagged geometry of man-made mountains. The structural integrity of this society is maintained through a rigorous intellectual framework, the integration of advanced mathematics, and the most sophisticated writing system in the Western Hemisphere. You observe a scribe dipping a brush into an inkpot made of a conch shell. He is not merely decorating, he is recording the flow of time and the movements of the cosmos, using a hieroglyphic system comprising hundreds of distinct, elaborate signs. These glyphs are phonetic, logographic, and highly flexible, allowing for the documentation of complex historical lineages, diplomatic treaties, and celestial cycles. Each stone stela being carved in the plaza below serves as a permanent hard drive, a data storage device that anchors the king's legitimacy in the incontrovertible truth of written history. Supporting this literacy is a mathematical engine of remarkable precision. The Maya utilize a base 20 or times vigesimal numbering system structured around bars and dots. As you watch a market administrator tallying rows of cacao beans, you witness the application of their greatest abstract discovery, the concept of zero, developed independently of Old World cultures. The Maya zero, often represented as a stylized shell, serves as a positional placeholder. This concept of zero allows their astronomers to calculate dates millions of years into the past and future, and it enables the state to manage the taxation and distribution of goods for 13 million people with surgical accuracy. Without this mathematical zero, the complex administration of the Classic period's governance and its monumental artistic output would collapse into disorganized guesswork. The visual landscape of 750 AD is a testament to this organizational power. You stand in the central precinct of a great city-state where the architecture is not the dull gray of weathered stone, but a riot of calculated color. The massive pyramids and administrative palacios are coated in thick layers of lime stucco, painted in deep cinnabar reds, vibrant blues, and ochre yellows. The midday sun is blinding, its rays reflecting off the polished, pigmented surfaces with such intensity that the air seems to shimmer with heat and the smell of fresh mineral paint. Artisans in specialized workshops across the city-states of Tikal, Copan, and Palenque are producing polychrome ceramics and jade jewelry at a volume never seen before. This surge in artistic output is the direct result of a stable food surplus and a rigid social stratification. The governance of the Divine Lords has reached a point of maximum complexity. They oversee a network of trade that moves obsidian, salt, and quetzal feathers across hundreds of miles of limestone roads. The gears of the sacred calendar and the secular administration are locked in a perfect, high-functioning synchronization. However, This vast human machine is entirely dependent on its ability to extract energy from the earth. The massive population you see milling through the painted plazas is not sustained by the jungle, but by the systematic times destruction and rebuilding of it. Every glyph carved, every pyramid plastered, is a debt drawn from the land. But this massive population relied on a single fragile staple that required constant environmental manipulation. By 750 AD, the lowland Maya landscape has been fundamentally re-engineered into a massive thermodynamic engine for the production of calories. You observe the transformation of the Petén Basin from a mosaic of primary rainforests into a hyper-managed agricultural grid. The demographic data is unequivocal. The population has reached an estimated 13 million individuals. This densitates a shift from extensive swidden or slash and burn techniques to a regime of total intensification. The primary biological driver of this civilization is Zea maize. It is the core carbohydrate, providing the heavy chemical energy required to sustain a dense, stratified society. Every hectare of land must now produce a specific high-yield caloric output to prevent systemic failure. To achieve this, the Maya have implemented the Chinampa system and extensive wetland reclamation. You watch laborers move through the bajos, the seasonal wetlands that once remained dormant during the inundation periods. These swamps are being methodically drained and partitioned into a series of raised, ridged fields. The technical process is labor-intensive. Muck is dredged from the canal bottoms and piled onto rectilinear platforms. This nutrient-rich sediment, often anaerobic in its lower layers, provides a high phosphorus base for the maize stalks. The scale of this engineering is vast, replacing nature with a calculated biological machine. To further enhance the soil chemistry, a strict protocol of fertilization is enforced. You observe the collection and systematic application of human feces to the fields, a necessary biological recycling process to replace the nitrogen and potassium stripped by successive harvests. This is not a matter of choice, but of survival. The soil of the tropical lowlands is naturally thin and prone to leaching under heavy rainfall. The smell of this rich turned earth, saturated with organic waste and decaying plant matter, hangs heavy in the humid heat of a terraced hillside field. It is a thick, cloying scent of productivity and rot, reflecting the narrow margins upon which the city-states now operate. Beyond the bajos, the topography dictates more complex engineering. You follow the stone-lined terraces that wrap around the limestone hillsides. These limestone retaining walls are built to prevent the catastrophic erosion of topsoil during the heavy tropical storms. It is a precise geological intervention. The soil is held in place by these artificial steps, creating microenvironments calibrated for maximum yield. The labor required to maintain these terraces is constant. Any breach in the wall results in the total loss of the growing medium into the valleys below. There is no longer any wild space. The jungle has been replaced by an anthropogenic forest of fruit-bearing trees and maize monocultures. The caloric needs of the population require that every square meter of the territory be accounted for in the state's agricultural ledger. As you navigate the periphery of a major center like Tikal or Karakol, the logistical reality becomes clear. The concept of carrying capacity is no longer a theoretical limit. It has become a physical wall. The population density has reached such a concentration that the ecological system is stretched to its breaking point. There is an absence of archaeological evidence for large-scale external migration during this period, signifying that the surrounding regions are equally saturated. The Maya are effectively locked into their environment. If the intensive farming protocols fail, there is no frontier to retreat to, and no surplus from neighbors to rely upon. Small-scale hunting of white-tailed deer has declined as the habitat for such fauna is converted into ridged fields, forcing a near-total dependence on carbonized maize and beans. This dietary specialization creates a biological vulnerability. The entire civilization now hinges on the predictable timing of the seasonal rains to activate the hydraulic systems. You see the farmers working in the relentless sun, their skin coated in the dust of the dry season, preparing the canal beds for the next cycle. They are part of a massive, synchronized effort controlled by the elite classes, who monitor the celestial cycles to determine the exact moment for sowing. The relationship between the ruler and the ruled is now cemented by this agricultural output. The king's legitimacy is functionally tied to the soil's productivity. The infrastructure, the cisterns, the dams, and the miles of terracing is the physical manifestation of a society that has attempted to master the tropical ecosystem through brute force and engineering. However, the equilibrium is fragile. The reliance on intensive reclamation means that any variation in the annual precipitation will have an immediate, non-linear impact on the caloric supply. The margins for error have been engineered out of the system. As the population pushed the land to its limit, the heavens began to withhold their essential gift. The dry earth waits, the canals stand empty, and the great machine of the Maya begins to grind against its own limitations. You stand at the precipice of a slow-motion catastrophe. The stability of the late classic Maya period was predicated on a caloric surplus, a world engineered to near perfection. However, by 760 AD, the mechanical limits of this artificial ecology were reached. You observe a transformation in the atmosphere above the Petun Basin. The reliable convection of the seasonal monsoons begins to falter. This is the onset of the tripartite drought model, a structural environmental breakdown proposed by researcher Richardson Gill. It is not a single sharp catastrophe, but a three-phase sequence of desiccation that would systematically dismantle the Mayan socio-political order over the next 150 years. In the first phase, beginning around 760 AD, the hydrological systems show the first signs of strain. Technical data derived from climate proxies indicates that annual precipitation decreased by 41 to 54% during these initial intervals. This is not merely a dry season extension, it is a fundamental shift in the regional water balance. You walk through the storage plazas of a center like Tikal or Karakol, and notice the low levels in the central reservoirs. These massive paved catchments now expose their limestone linings to the sun. The sound of dry wind whistling through empty ceramic water jugs, large-necked tinagers, replaces the rhythmic splashing of daily life. As the 8th century closes, the second phase of the tripartite model intensifies the pressure. Between 810 and 860 AD, the droughts become more frequent and more severe. It is during these peaks that the data reveals a staggering 70% reduction in rainfall. At this level of water scarcity, the biological requirements for maize, the staple crop comprising up to 70% of the Maya diet, cannot be met. The chinampas and terrace systems you previously saw flourishing are now parched, the soil cracking into hexagonal plates. To the Maya, this is not merely a meteorological anomaly. It is a breach of the cosmological contract. The Kahul Ajal, the Divine Lord, maintains his legitimacy through his perceived ability to intercede with the rain god Chak. As the dry cycles persist, you witness the erosion of royal authority. The rituals become more desperate. The frequency of bloodletting increases, and the iconography on stelae shifts toward frantic depictions of water-bringing ceremonies. But as the rain fails to materialize, the subjects of these kings realize that the rituals are hollow. The failure of the Kuhul Ajau to produce rain leads to a disintegration of the social hierarchy, as the divine right to rule dissolves alongside the vanishing harvest. By the third phase, spanning from approximately 860 to 910 AD, the system enters its terminal decline. This final interval of the tripartite drought provides the definitive blow to an already fractured society. The malnutrition among the lower classes becomes a measurable pathology. Skeletal remains from this period show increased evidence of cribra orbiellia and porotic hyperostosis, indicators of severe iron deficiency, anemia, and nutrient loss. You observe the abandonment of the massive public works projects. The artisans, no longer supported by a functioning grain tribute system, leave their limestone carvings unfinished in the quarries. The bureaucracy that once managed the complex distribution of crops collapses, as there is no longer a surplus to distribute. Population centers that once housed tens of thousands begin to thin out. You see families packing what little they have to migrate toward the coast or the few remaining perennial water sources, leaving the great masonry cities to the encroaching jungle. Ah, the silence in the plazas is heavy, broken only by the grit of dust underfoot and the relentless, dry heat. This 150-year process demonstrates the fragility of hyper-intensive agriculture. When confronted with sustained environmental volatility, the tripartite model illustrates how a civilization at the peak of its technical and artistic complexity can be brought to a standstill by the simple absence of water. The sound of that wind in the empty jugs is the sound of a structural failure, the audible resonance of a civilization losing its grip on the landscape. The political and theological framework of the classic Maya was built on the premise of seasonal abundance. Without it, the central pillars of their world crumbled into the dust of the dry fields. To understand the true scale of this drought, modern science looks not at legends, but at the mud. Through the study of lake sediment cores and stalagmites, we find the chemical signatures of this era's suffering. The story of the Maya collapse is a stark reminder of our dependence on the rhythms of the earth. When those rhythms fail, even the most divine of kings cannot hold back the encroaching wilderness. The wind continues its whistle through the ruins, a somber eulogy for a world that ran dry. The transition from archaeological observation to laboratory reconstruction shifts your perspective from the macroscopic ruins of stone to the microscopic record of atoms. The collapse of the Maya, once a subject of historical anecdote, is now a problem of chemistry. You stand within the sterile, humming environment of a modern paleoclimatologic laboratory, where the ambient temperature is tightly controlled to protect the integrity of organic samples. The air is filtered and thin, smelling faintly of ozone and industrial cleaning agents. Before you lies a long cylindrical tray containing a lake sediment core extracted from the bottom of Lake Chichamkanab. You observe the physical texture of this core. It is gritty and stratified, a compressed timeline of millennia where each millimeter of gray and tan mud represents the passing of seasons. This core is the primary document of the ghost in the lake. While the stone palaces above ground tell of kings and wars, these sediments tell of the biosphere. To extract the truth from this mud, the investigative team utilizes X-ray fluorescence, or XRF. You watch as the scanner moves over the sediment with rhythmic precision. The XRF measures the concentrations of titanium and iron. In the geological context of the Yucatan, these elements are indicators of terrestrial runoff. High levels of titanium signify heavy monsoons washing minerals from the land into the lake. Conversely, the sharp drops in these metallic signatures in the layers corresponding to the late 9th century provide a quantitative record of the cessation of rains. Adjacent to the sediment core station, a technician prepares microscopic gastropod shells for isotopic analysis. These tiny, calcified remains of ancient lake snails are the silent witnesses to the terminal classic collapse. You note the clinical delicacy required to handle these specimens. The methodology relies on the measurement of oxygen isotopes, specifically the ratio between oxygen-18 and oxygen-16 within the calcium carbonate of the shells. Because oxygen-16 is lighter, it evaporates more readily than the heavier oxygen-18. In periods of high evaporation and low precipitation, the water in the lake becomes enriched with oxygen-18. As the gastropods built their shells, they incorporated this chemical signature, creating a biological ledger of the precipitation-evaporation balance. The data emerging from the mass spectrometer indicates a staggering shift. The ratio spikes precisely at the moment the Maya inscriptions cease, indicating a deficit in rainfall that reached catastrophic proportions. Beyond the lake beds, the investigation moves into the karst underworld. You observe several speleothem stalagmites recovered from caves like Yokbalam. These cave formations act as natural chronometers. Like the rings of a tree, they grow in incremental, microscopic layers as water drips from the ceiling. Because the caves are sealed environments, they preserve a high-resolution record of humidity. Paleoclimatologists analyze the geochemical composition of each layer to provide quantitative humidity and rainfall estimates. These stone records confirm the sediment data, a series of multi-decadal droughts, that were not merely seasonal variations but systemic climatic shifts. As the chemical mapping continues, another indicator emerges: sulfur. You examine the digital readouts showing sulfur concentrations within the lake sediments. Sulfur acts as a chemical fingerprint for extreme drought. When water levels in the Yucatan lakes dropped due to lack of rain, the saturation levels forced minerals like gypsum to precipitate out. These minerals, rich in calcium sulfate, settled in thick white crusts at the bottom of the lake. The presence of these gypsum-rich layers in the sediment cores provides an undeniable physical marker of an environment pushed beyond its capacity to support the massive hydraulic infrastructure of the Maya cities. The cumulative data represents a forensic reconstruction of the 8th and 9th centuries. It removes the ambiguity of the collapse. You see the convergence of the data points, the depletion of titanium and iron, the enrichment of heavy oxygen isotopes, and the thickening of sulfurous crusts. The laboratory environment remains quiet, save for the steady hum of processes and the cycling of the air filtration system, but the data on the screens is violent. It describes a world where the water cycle, the very foundation of the Divine King's authority, had fractured. The transition from the gritty mud of the core to the digital graphs on the monitor completes the picture of a civilization's end. The data confirms a catastrophe that triggered a chain reaction of social failure. The year is 810 AD, and the rhythm of the Maya heartland, a cadence once defined by the rhythmic strike of limestone chisels and the chanting of labor gangs, has entered a period of terminal deceleration. In the preceding decades, the hydrological fail-safes of the central lowlands had disintegrated under the pressure of prolonged drought. Yet it is during this 9th century window that the physical infrastructure of the classic period Maya time officially ceases its expansion. As you traverse the great plaza of a nameless city-state in the central P10, you are witnessing more than a recession. You are observing the statistical end of a chronological tradition. The long count calendar, which once meticulously anchored the divine right of kings to the movement of celestial bodies, begins to falter. By 830 AD, a total absence of new architecture is recorded across the central Maya area. The grand liturgical projects, the massive pyramidal bases and vaulted palace complexes, stand as skeletal remains of an exhausted bureaucracy. The silence in these plazas is no longer a moment of peace, but a permanent state of decay. You walk toward a stela intended to commemorate the Katun ending. The stone is a massive block of limestone, hauled from a quarry several kilometers away, but it remains horizontal, half buried in the logic of its own abandonment. At the base of the stone you observe an unfinished carving where the glyphs for the ruler's lineage abruptly terminate. The chisel marks are still visible, sharp and unweathered, indicating a sudden cessation of labor. This is the material evidence of a society that has reached what Joseph Tainter identifies as the point of declining marginal returns. For centuries, the Maya elite responded to stress by increasing social complexity, building larger temples, conducting more intricate rituals, and expanding the hierarchy. However, by the late 9th century, each additional unit of investment in this complexity yielded less and less stability. The energy required to maintain the status quo now exceeds the energy the environment can provide. The investment in monumental architecture, once a tool for social cohesion, has become a thermodynamic burden the peasantry can no longer shoulder. The consequence of this systemic failure is not a quiet evacuation, but a protracted and violent demographic contraction. Turning your gaze from the abandoned stela to the periphery of the Copan Valley, the scale of the collapse becomes quantifiable. You are standing in a region that once supported a peak population of 28,000 individuals. As your perspective shifts toward the year 900 AD, that census has plummeted to a mere 15,000. This 46% reduction in human density is etched into the landscape. The terraced hillsides, once meticulously maintained to prevent soil erosion and maximize maize yields, are beginning to slump. The lack of labor to clear the encroaching tropical flora means that the forest is reclaiming the silt traps. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation. There is a complete lack of wood smoke in the air. a sensory marker of the thousands of hearths that have gone cold as families fled toward the fringes of the collapsing state. As resources dwindle, the social fabric is torn by endemic warfare. You observe the crude modifications made to the city's architectural layout, defensive walls, or ramparts, hastily constructed from the ripped-out facades of older, more elegant buildings. These are not the confident fortifications of a rising empire. They are the desperate barricades of a dying one. The competition for the remaining arable land and the few functional aguadas, or water reservoirs, has turned neighbors into existential rivals. You see spears tipped with obsidian that are no longer used for ritual bloodletting, but for the messy, disorganized slaughter of the desperate. The technical mechanism of kingship has failed. You stand in a plaza where the silence is absolute, save for the occasional clatter of a limestone fragment falling from a frieze. This era represented the metabolic failure of a civilization that had overextended its ecological credit. While the southern heartland fell into ruin, the Maya story did not end. It merely moved. The abandonment of the southern lowlands between 800 and 900 AD did not signal the end of the Maya civilization, but rather a profound geographic and economic pivot. As the monumental centers of the Peton fell silent and the long count calendar was discarded, the locus of power bypassed the exhausted inland soils in favor of the karst plains and coastal fringes of the northern Yucatan Peninsula. This period, known as the post-classic, was defined by a transition from the divine kingship of isolated jungle polities to a pragmatic, outward-facing mercantile system. You observe this shift not in the construction of massive funerary pyramids, but in the development of sophisticated port facilities and a newfound reliance on the sea. The inland collapse had proven that isolation and rigid agricultural dependence were vulnerabilities. The North responded by embracing the horizon. In this new era, the jungle's heavy silence was replaced by the energetic pulse of the coast. The era of the god-king was fading, giving way to the era of the merchant. This was the northern pivot, a transformation where survival was no longer found in the shadows of the forest, but in the spray of the saltwater waves. The Maya were no longer looking inward, they were looking outward. Chichen Itza rose to preeminence during this era, functioning as the primary engine of this northern resurgence. Its hegemony was not rooted solely in territorial conquest, but in its absolute control over seaborne trade and long-range contacts. By securing the salt beds of the northern coast and establishing trade links that extended as far as central Mexico and the gold-producing regions of lower Central America, Chichen Itza integrated the Maya world into a broader Mesoamerican economic network. The technical mechanism of this power was the trade canoe, massive, hollowed-out cedar vessels upward of 50 feet in length, capable of carrying 20 to 30 paddlers and tons of cargo. You stand on the shore at Isla Cerritos, the primary port for Chichen Itza, where the air is thick with the sharp, corrosive scent of salt and the briny tang of the Gulf waters. Here, the logistical reality of the post-classic is visible. Stacks of obsidian blades, bags of cacao beans used as currency, and meticulously dried fish ready for transport into the interior. The immense scale of these canoes carving through the waves signaled a culture that had mastered the oceans to ensure its own immortality. While the classic period was characterized by a fragmentation of power, the post-classic saw state formation cycles renewed with a focus on institutional durability. The collapse of Chichen Itza's centralized authority around 1200 AD did not result in a second Dark Age, but rather the rise of Mayapan. Established as a walled city, Mayapan became the primary political capital of the Yucatan, governed not by a single Q-Hill Ajar or Holy Lord, but by a joint council of noble lineages known as a multipole. This was an architectural and political departure. The city was densely packed, housing an estimated 12,000 to 15,000 inhabitants within its defensive perimeters. The monumental scale had shrunk, replaced by a bureaucratic efficiency designed to manage the flow of commodities, cotton, honey, and salt across the peninsula. You can hear the constant rhythmic scraping of basalt grinders and the sharp crack of flint being knapped in the crowded residential wards, sounds that reflect a society prioritized towards production and regional exchange. This wasn't a kingdom of monuments. It was a kingdom of commerce and survival. The stone walls of Mayapan protected a new way of life, where the power was shared among many rather than held by one. This mercantile institutionalism allowed the Maya to thrive for centuries in an environment with limited surface water. By utilizing cenotes, natural limestone sinkholes, and sophisticated chaltunes or cisterns, Mayapan bypassed the hydraulic failures that had doomed the south. However, even these resilient structures were subject to the pressures of internal factionalism. In 1448 AD, a few decades before the first European ships would appear on the horizon, Mayapan fell. The city was sacked and abandoned following a revolt by the Sioux lineage against the ruling Kokong family. This internal disintegration fractured the peninsula into 16 smaller provinces, each struggling for autonomy. The sophisticated maritime networks remained, yet the centralized political shield that had protected the northern trade routes was gone. As you look out from the coastal cliffs of Tulum, the sight of large trading canoes navigating the coastline remains a constant, their paddlers fighting the steady tug of the Caribbean currents. Yet the geopolitical landscape they navigate is now a patchwork of divided territories. This resilient northern culture would soon face a threat from across the sea that no reservoir could protect against. The horizon was no longer just a trade route. It was about to become a frontier. War. You look upon a fragmented landscape. It is 1511. The once unified power of Mayapan has dissolved into 18 rival provinces, each governed by its own council. There is no unified front, only disorder. A Spanish caravel, the Santa Maria de la Barca, strikes a reef. You watch as survivors drift for 13 days, finally washing ashore on the east coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. This first contact is not a meeting of equals, but a brutal collision. While most perish, two men, Geronimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero, survive to become cultural bridges. You observe the subtle transition as the first Spanish metal instruments, blades and buckles, appear in indigenous villages. These metallic artifacts gleam with a distinct cold luster amidst the limestone dust. It is the first flash of steel in the jungle, signaling the intrusion of an external metallurgy that the Maya had never seen on a mass scale. The old world is beginning to crack. Following these accidental encounters, the Spanish crown initiates formalized conquest efforts in 1530. The Francisco de Montejo campaigns begin a systematic subjugation through the concept of the encomienda system. You are witnessing a grinding, multi-generational erosion of traditional life. The sophisticated Maya legal and religious systems are being overwritten by colonial administration. Look closely at the transformation of the landscape. The very stones of ancient temples are being dismantled. They are repurposed to build the foundations of Catholic missions. The primary sound of the village square shifts. No longer do you hear the rhythmic chanting of priests. Instead, there is the heavy, rhythmic tolling of a mission bell. It is a sonic marker of a new order, a heavy iron heartbeat imposed by the Spanish calendar over the ancient cycles of the sun. But steel was not the only killer. Alongside the violence, invisible pathogens move ahead of the Spanish vanguard. While smallpox ravages the land, you must also note the subtle, creeping impact of American trypanosomiasis, Chagas disease. Spread by insects thriving in thatched roofs, it weakens the very heart of the population over decades. The Maya moved into reductions, compacted settlements designed for control and tax collection. This forced density only accelerates the spread of death. You see the demographic collapse in the empty eyes of the survivors and the growing silence of the streets. Biological warfare, though unintentional, is stripping the capacity for resistance. The population is plummeting, recorded in the cold ink of regional census data. The strength of 1,000 years is fading. Yet one pocket of sovereignty remains. In the dense, swampy interior of the Petén Basin, the island city-state of Noshpetan stands defiant. Situated on Lake Petén Isa, it is the last bastion of the Maya. For nearly 2 centuries, the Itza play a complex game of diplomacy and skirmish. They exploit the jungle, a terrain that renders Spanish cavalry useless and rusts their breastplates in the perpetual humidity. You stand on the muddy banks of the lake and observe the stone fortifications. It is the 1690s, and while the rest of the world has fallen to the viceroyalty of New Spain, no Peton remains untouched. But the end comes on March 13th, 1697. A shallow draught boat equipped with a bronze cannon appears on the water. The flash of artillery bridges the gap the jungle could not protect. By midday, Nochpeton falls. The last independent king is captured. The cities are swallowed by the green canopy for centuries, waiting for a traveler to find them again. The year is 1841. You are hacking through the dense undergrowth of the Yucatan Peninsula, a landscape that has spent the better part of a millennium reclaiming what was once cleared for the grand plazas of the classic period. The humidity is a physical weight, pressing against your lungs, while the pervasive shrill of cicadas creates a wall of white noise. With a definitive stroke of the machete, the steel edge strikes something harder than wood. Then you clear away a curtain of parasitic vines to reveal a face carved in limestone. It is a stela, weathered by centuries of tropical rain, its basalt-like rigidity staring back from the past with an unblinking, regal dignity. This encounter marks the arrival of John Lloyd Stephens and the illustrator Frederick Catherwood. Their 1841 travelogue, Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, would serve as the primary catalyst for the Western world's engagement with Maya archaeology. Prior to this, the ruins were largely regarded as anomalies or the work of lost seafaring tribes. Stephens, however, argued for the indigenous origin of these structures, documenting the precise architectural layouts and the intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions that had remained silent since the Spanish conquest. Technically, the travelogue shifted the Western perception of the Maya from a primitive footnote to a sophisticated civilization capable of monumental engineering. In the decades following Stephens's work, the nascent field of archaeology began to deconstruct the narrative of the collapse. For early 20th century scholars, the abandonment of the southern lowlands was viewed as a sudden, cataclysmic termination, a violent end to a golden age. However, modern stratigraphic analysis and the decipherment of the Maya script have refined this view. The collapse is now understood as a complex transformation. It was not a uniform cessation of life, but a geopolitical and social reorientation. The divine kingship, the Kuhal-Ajau system, failed as a governing mechanism, leading populations to migrate toward the northern lowlands and the highland regions. This was a survival strategy, an organized dispersal from the centralized urban centers that had become unsustainable under the stresses of warfare and resource depletion. To understand the environmental drivers of this transformation, you must look beneath the surface of the Earth. Paleoclimatologists have spent the last several decades extracting sediment cores from the bottom of Lake Chichancanab. These lake cores act as a chemical ledger, recording the oxygen isotopes and gypsum concentrations of the past. The data revealed a brutal reality. The interval around 1000 AD was the driest period in 7,000 years. The carbon-heavy atmosphere of the 21st century allows researchers to map these ancient drought cycles with terrifying precision. For the Maya, this meant the periodic failure of the Milpa system, the exhaustion of the Chalchuns, the underground cisterns, and the subsequent erosion of the social contract between the rulers, who claimed to control the rain, and the peasantry, who relied on it. The dust in these cores is the physical remain of a landscape that had been pushed beyond its ecological carrying capacity. Yet, the narrative of the vanished Maya is a fallacy born of colonial perception. While the stone cities fell into ruin, the biological and cultural lineage of the Maya did not disappear. You observe this persistence in the modern era, where over 6 million Maya people continue to inhabit their ancestral lands. They preserve a heritage that has mutated but never broken. The technical vocabulary of the ancient scribes survives in over 30 distinct Mayan languages. The heritage is not merely found in the museum-ready jade masks. It is found in the physical act of traditional weaving, the continued cultivation of heirloom maize, and the syncretic religious ceremonies. As you analyze the transition, the sheer scale of Maya durability becomes the defining characteristic. The story of the Maya remains a testament to human ingenuity in the face of a volatile planet.